Every other king in this saga gets a grave, a statue, a line in a history book that says who they were before the crown ruined them. Theoden gets carried home to Rohan. Denethor gets a pyre. Even Sauron, formless and reduced to an eye, still has a name people whisper with actual meaning attached to it. The most powerful of the Nazgûl gets nothing. Not a name, not a kingdom anyone remembers fondly, not even a body you could point to and say, that used to be a man. Tolkien wrote an entire legendarium obsessed with lineage, with who begat whom, with genealogies that stretch back thousands of years in the appendices, and for the single most dangerous servant Sauron ever created. He simply declined to tell you who he used to be. That is not a gap in the story. Read it closely enough, and it starts to look like the story itself. Most people who talk about the Witch King talk about the moment he dies, the prophecy, the twist, the woman, and the hobbit, doing what no living man supposedly could. It is a great scene. It is also the very end of a much longer erasure that started long before Éowyn ever pulled off her helmet. And I think if you only look at his death, you miss the actual horror of what happened to him. He had a name once. Now he is only a title. Sit with that for a second before I explain why it matters more than it sounds like it should. Here is what we actually know, and it is worth being honest about how little that is. He was mortal. He was a king, or a lord, or a great warrior. Tolkien lists these as possibilities for all 9 of the Ringwraiths, and never narrows it down for their leader specifically. He came from one of the great human civilizations touched by Númenor's legacy. And at some point, he took a ring, and the ring did to him exactly what it was built to do to men like him. It stretched his life, unnaturally thin, wore him down to something less than flesh, and gave him power in exchange for erasing every part of him that used to matter to anyone. I keep coming back to this detail. Tolkien names entire minor Rohirric horse breeders in the appendices. He gives us the family tree of hobbits. Nobody else in the story even mentions. And the most powerful undead servant Sauron ever fielded doesn't even get a footnote with his old name in it. That is not an oversight from a writer who tracked lineage the way most people track their own children. That is a choice. Whoever this man was, the story has decided he is no longer worth remembering as himself. And honestly, that might be the cruelest thing that happens to any character in the entire legendarium, worse than dying. Worse than losing a war, being erased while you're still walking around. Now think about what he does with the small amount of self Sauron leaves him. He builds a kingdom, Angmar, north of the Shire, north of everything the hobbits will ever wander through, and here's the detail that gets skipped past constantly. Angmar was never meant to be his kingdom. It was built for one purpose, grinding down Arnor, the northern remnant of the old human civilization that split apart generations earlier. He is handed a throne that exists purely as a weapon against other people's homes, not a legacy, a tool with a crown balanced on top of it. And what does he do with that tool? He spends roughly 3 centuries wearing Arnor down, not a quick conquest, not a single dramatic battle you'd put on a poster. A slow, grinding, multi-generational war against Arthedain, against Cardolan, against Rudar kingdoms that used to be one people, now fractured and dying slowly under pressure from the north. I find this detail almost unbearably fitting, because it's the exact same mechanism that made him what he is. The ring didn't destroy him in one dramatic moment either. It ground him down across centuries, until there was nothing recognizably human left standing. He becomes the architect of the same kind of slow erosion that already happened to him. That's not a coincidence a careful reader should skip past. That's the entire shape of the character. He had a name once. Now he is only a title. Eventually he wins, in the narrow sense that matters to him. Arthedain falls. Fornost, the last real stronghold, gets taken. The last king of that line, Arvedui, runs north and freezes to death, trying to escape by ship, and that's it. An entire branch of the human line. The one that could trace itself back through actual named ancestors all the way to Númenor, just stops. The Witch King did that, personally. Over centuries, with patience most villains in this story never get credit for having. And it still isn't his victory. Days later, allied forces Elrond's people, ships sent up from the Grey Havens arrive and break his army completely. He flees. The kingdom he spent 300 years building collapses almost as fast as the one he just destroyed. Whoever he used to be, whatever kind of king he might have been in a life that got cut short by a ring, he never actually gets to keep anything. Not the throne handed to him, not the enemy kingdom he ground into dust, not even his own army in the end. Then he disappears. For centuries. No records, no sightings worth writing down until he resurfaces in Mordor, folded back into the other 8, no longer a king of anywhere, just the strongest piece in someone else's collection. I think this is the part that actually gets me, more than anything he does on the battlefield later. He had an entire arc, a kingdom, a war, a dynasty he personally ended, and none of it becomes part of who he is by the time the main story starts. It just gets absorbed, consumed, filed away as backstory. Nobody in the present timeline even remembers accurately. He built something monumental and evil and real, and the story simply moved on without him, the same way it moved on without his name. When he comes back into the light of the main narrative, it's not as a king reclaiming anything. It's as the commander of Minas Morgul, and here's a detail I think people rush past, because the horror movie imagery is so loud, it drowns out the irony underneath it. Minas Morgul used to be Minas Ithil, one of the twin cities of Gondor, beautiful, by every account that survives. He takes it, corrupts it, and turns it into a tower that radiates sickness instead of light. He didn't just conquer a city, he did to a piece of architecture exactly what happened to him. Something that used to be beautiful and specifically human, hollowed out and repurposed until only the shape of what it used to be remains, wearing corruption like a second skin. He had a name once, now he is only a title. And then there's the prophecy, which I think most retellings treat as a clever twist mechanism instead of what it actually is, a description of exactly how blind this creature has become about his own nature. Glorfindel tells him, centuries before it matters, that no man's hand will bring him down. And the Witch King believes this so completely that by the time he's standing on the Pelennor fields telling Éowyn that no living man may hinder him, he is not bluffing. He genuinely believes himself untouchable because a very old, very specific sentence told him so. He never once considers that the sentence has a hole in it exactly his size. Not because he's stupid, because after everything that hollowed him out, after centuries of being nothing but a function of someone else's power, he has stopped being the kind of mind that questions its own certainty. Certainty is basically all he has left. His identity got replaced with a role, and roles don't wonder if the prophecy about them might be worded a little too precisely for comfort. Éowyn takes her helmet off, says 4 words, and an entity that spent thousands of years being feared as something close to unkillable folds in seconds, because it turns out the last thing keeping him standing was never power. It was a belief about himself that was wrong in a way he never had the humility left to question. I don't think that's a twist. I think that's the whole point of him, delivered in miniature at the exact moment he dies. He had a name once, now he is only a title. Here's what actually sits with me about this character, more than any other villain in the entire saga. Sauron at least gets remembered as Sauron. Saruman gets a name people still argue about. Even the lesser Nazgûl get to exist as a group with some sense of collective identity. The Witch King is the single most powerful, most feared, most historically consequential servant of the entire War of the Ring, and by the time he dies, on a field outside a burning city, no one watching even knows what to call the thing collapsing in front of them, let alone who it used to be. That is not an accident of how Tolkien wrote him. I genuinely think it's the most honest thing anyone in this story says about what absolute power actually costs a person without ever putting it in a single line of dialogue. You don't get to keep being someone once you've traded away that much of yourself for that much strength. You get to be very, very powerful for a very long time, right up until the specific, narrow condition nobody bothered explaining to you arrives and takes the only thing you actually had left. Not your name, you lost that centuries ago. Just the last illusion that you were still someone at all.